Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll let people start streaming in, and then we'll start in about a minute. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to our session. So this session is called Reimagining a Sustainable Economy. I'm the session chair, Gabriel Matthew from American University. So in terms of how this is going to go, we'll have 20 minutes for presenters, 5 minutes for discussions, then about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A and a group discussion at the end. So we'll just follow the order on the program. So we'll start with Don Goldstein of Allegheny College. So he'll be telling us about a regional place-based strategy for the Green New Deal, breaking the Trumpist coalition.
Thank you, Gabe. Get my screen shared here. And we'll be off. So what I'm going to talk about today is the result of a long-term activist research project that I've been involved in here in northwestern Pennsylvania, up near Lake Erie in the Ohio and New York state borders. And I'm going to put it in the context of, or use it as an illustration for, an argument for basing Green New Deal politics and program building on the connection between small regions and what can be accomplished there and the Green New Deal at a national level. And I want to put this in the context of the political viability of a Green New Deal, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And when we look at that situation, we're facing a kind of a frustrating disconnect between voters' demonstrated concerns about jobs and community insecurity, spreading national disasters, natural disasters of all kinds. Guess we're having national disasters too. And especially among white rural voters, the politics of climate denial and kind of a fixation on a mythical fossil fuel past and a sense of zero-sum intra-class, intra-working class hostility. Unfortunately, that kind of politics adds up nationally to a pretty solid congressional blockage for passage of a Green New Deal. So it's something that we have to get past. And what I'm going to do here is try to get beyond the sort of abstract promise of a Green New Deal could create so many jobs nationally to a more place-based methodology for simultaneously building a Green New Deal program and a coalition or political platform by which a coalition could be built. So here are very quickly just the elements we're going to go through here this morning here at any rate. Talk about what I mean by a Green New Deal and by Trumpism. Talk about a little bit about the logic of the kind of Green New Deal regionalism that I'm talking about, and look at the process, the methodology for creating a Green New Deal scenario for a small region. I'm going to use my case study of Northwestern PA and then do some summing up. So first of all, what do I mean by a Green New Deal? There's a number of proposals floating around, and really I'm looking at within the more holistic sustainable development program that AOC and Bernie have spelled out in their proposals. I'm going to be looking specifically at the climate change related stuff, which consists of the following sources and components: power, transportation, agriculture, energy efficiency, manufacturing of renewable technologies, and climate risk infrastructure. And I hope you'll see as I go through this how each of these components at a national level gets worked into, plugged into the creation of a small region scenario. What do I mean by Trumpism? Well, unfortunately, we're all pretty familiar with that at this point. It's a Trump himself certainly projects a politics of hang on to what you have, protect yourself against them because they are trying to take it away, the undeserving, the people of color, the poor. There's a focus on this mythical past, as I said, in which fossil fuel related jobs just, provided wonderful livelihoods for everyone. Even in its heyday, that wasn't really too true. And in a place like Pennsylvania, which was dominated by King coal for so many decades, but now it's an almost minuscule fraction of the workforce. And a final element of Trumpism per se is that climate change climate science, is portrayed as a kind of a Trojan horse for elite control and for the plan of elites to impose their vision of a parched tree-hugging culture on the people of the United States. So Trumpism really both reflects and also drives this more general socio-political moment that I think it's important also to take note of. There's terrific job and labor market precarity throughout the economy at this point, and also acute social distress, the so-called deaths of despair that people have talked about, which has kind of come alongside now the long-time suffering of more marginalized communities in the US. An anti-government perspective that distrusts any kind of government problem solving, with the exception of mass incarceration and repression and militarism, which is fine. But at the same time, part of that moment has been over the last preceding Trump, but intensifying since he was elected, the spread of a wide variety of national, state, and local progressive movements, which can open doors for the kind of process that I'm talking about here. So the logic of Green New Deal regionalism, as I'm going to propose it here, is that even a national level or a macro level argument about the economic potential of a Green New Deal is quite abstract. And at the local level where politics happen, it loses out to Trumpist arguments that focus people on what they know and trying to hang on to what they know. What I propose is to concretize the promise of a Green New Deal at the level of regions that share some distinctive characteristics, consisting of the kinds of impacts that they're going to directly face and are facing from climate change, not just direct, but also indirect impacts that are likely to be induced by changes happening more broadly in markets and policy frameworks and whatnot in the train of climate change. And finally, to analyze the resources and assets that regions have through which they might make adaptive and mitigative steps that could plug into and be reinforced by a national Green New Deal, which, being there on a national level, will solve a lot of local decision-making problems that are currently bedeviling people trying to deal with this locally now decision makers are faced with the need to make choices whose outcomes will depend upon choices and steps that are taking place far beyond them. The presence of a national GND would significantly reduce that kind of uncertainty. Let's look at this through the case study that I mentioned. I'm analyzing particularly the 6-county region south and east of Erie County, which is Pennsylvania's sole piece of Lake Erie. This is a region that shares a lot in common with the southern Great Lakes generally in the US. And so to one extent or another, the analysis developed here could be useful in looking at a region all the way from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, across in the east to Rochester, New York. But the data and the specifics are developed here with respect to Northwest PA itself. The methodology that was used in coming up with this scenario is spelled out in much, much greater detail in a paper that I published in Technological Forecasting and Social Change a few years ago. But very briefly, it consists of starting out as a researcher with a literature review, looking at the local data, coalescing a set of prior expectations, then developing a working hypothesis, and in particular, developing a sense of how a local scenario could affect and be affected by some of those broader induced shifts in markets and policies, and then developing a kind of a two-way table showing the likely direct and indirect climate impacts in the region against the potential of local resources to respond to those. This is iteratively kind of leavened through a wide range of interviews with folks with technical and business and labor and political backgrounds, just to get their take on the scenario as it's being developed, as it's emerging, and find out if there are factors that are being missed and need to be considered. So that is the methodology. Let me just kind of quickly run through the results here. The story about direct climate impacts in this particular region is very different from many. The story is short and simple. There's going to be a lot more rain and a lot more storms in this area, and it's already been happening for many decades. Temperatures have not been rising so much. We do not have any kind of a drought or fire issues here. And neither rise nor fall of the Great Lakes seems to be in the offing. But what is happening in this region of the country is more rainfall and more frequent and intense storm activity. This is data that I analyzed based on Pennsylvania state data. And it shows that there's been a rather remarkable increase in the amount of precipitation during the 20th century. It's risen from about 36 inches annually for this region of the state to close to 46 inches annually. And whether you look at it in terms of within year variability or variability from year to year, the standard deviation of rainfall amounts is increasing significantly as we go. And we're seeing that. We get bigger storms. And if you look at the NOAA maps and the FEMA floodplain maps for the region here, you see that floodplains are being expanded and in the delineations, and that what used to be 100-year storms are now considered to be 50-year storms. Let's take a look at some of the regional characteristics and assets in relation to what are likely to be the climate-induced broader market and policy shifts. This is a map of rail freight waybills, and you can see Lake Erie in the sort of center right of the picture here is right at the juncture of major east-west rail freight networks. and that turns out to be important for the scenario. In addition, Erie is right at the southern edge, along the southern edge of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway shipping lanes, which is something that could come into play as well. This is a local, very world-class shipbuilder in Erie, Pennsylvania, where the docks and related facilities are still quite robust. There is also a nationally important precision and structural steel working industry in this region here that goes back to the region's industrial heyday. This is General Electric's locomotive plant in Erie, PA. Most of the big shops are now closed, but there is still a very vibrant local machining industry here. Hardwood biomass is another big potential. There's a lot of woods around here and a significant hardwoods industry. Its pulpwood and its waste cuttings used to go to a paper pulp mill that International Paper had in Erie. That's been closed. European buyers have been sniffing around here, looking at whether they could use this as a source for wood pellets for the European market. And finally, we got a lot of wind along that lake shore. And that could be important as well in light of what's likely to be happening as global and national markets and policy frameworks adjust to the need to fight climate change. Here are the basic components of the scenario that we came up with. The pictures on the left here I'll talk about a little bit later, but we came up with 6 potential regional components. One is to build out rail freight capabilities and facilities. Second, to do the same for Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway shipping lane facilities. And those have to be linked. There have to be intermodal linkages between the two for that to really have much traction. Going around the outside here, biomass supply, we need a pellet producing facility, as well as those intermodal linkages to get the product out to the lakeshore for seaway shipping. Both offshore and onshore wind are commercially viable, would be commercially viable here, and we need to tap into that. Then in terms of climate risk, stormwater infrastructure is going to have to be upgraded. Bridges and culverts and drainage systems that were built to spec 50 or 75 years ago are no longer going to be doing the job. And finally, the metalworking industry here could become a significant producer of components for most of these other scenario elements. So here we're beginning to look at the sort of rich web of interactions and complementarities among these activities. And you can see that each of them creates direct demand for at least one of the others. This is important. This is a cluster analysis kind of a logic, and one that will be, is part of what gives a regional GND planning process its teeth, or we hope that gives it its teeth and its robustness. In addition to direct demand relationships, there are a whole set of shared activities and capabilities that would be mutually reinforced among the elements of the scenario. And this is where the pictures come in. This is a rail yard at the top, a construction site, production site for deploying offshore wind, and a shipping facility at the bottom. And the capabilities, the technologies, the infrastructure that are required for all of them are quite similar. And this again is an important mutually reinforcing virtuous cycle type of feature that is important here. Now, the question is, what kind of of traction did we get with this? And as I said, this is an activist research project. I did it, the academic component based at Allegheny College, but was plugged into work going on region-wide to promote this idea. And basically, the dominant capitalists in our area are they're manufacturers, metal workers, and they had no interest in it whatsoever. They are globally integrated, and their choices are regionally disintegrative, and they're happy with that. Labor also was disinterested. This Shell's ethane cracking plant in Monica, PA is not far south of here, and labor is very focused on getting those construction jobs and not too interested in the kinds of what they view as pie in the sky jobs that offshore wind could yield. So I'm running out of time here, but let me just sort of close up by noting that this top left map is major rail networks. The top right map is major wind resources, and the bottom map, of course, is the 2020 voting patterns. And if we are projecting this kind of regional economic and environmental development on a national scale, we should not have these kinds of solid red corridors in this country. Wyoming should be a blue state. There should be nothing the matter with Kansas, and we should have a solid blue wall across the southern Great Lakes. So the economics is political here, and I would propose that the kind of Green New Deal, local, national, in tandem planning that we could do here could generate a political platform that could break down those Trumpist divisions with an inclusive, locally persuasive model of how to cope with climate change. And I'll stop right there.
All right, thanks so much. I'll be the discussant. 1 second, I've got a chat. All right. Okay. All right, everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Let me get started. All right, so I'm discussing a regional place-based strategy for the Green New Deal, breaking the Trumpist coalition. All right, so in terms of breaking the Trumpist coalition, we know that extreme right parties have been doing very well in the 21st century, that kind of traditional center-left parties, at least, have done very badly. Neoliberalism, kind of broadly defined, is much less popular than it was at the end of the 20th century. But obviously, I think the extreme right is much worse. It poses a electoral threat if they have more success. So how do we break their coalition? So this paper is going to propose a way forward using place-based policies. So in terms of the Green New Deal and lagging regions, we're already going to have some issues with lagging regions. You know, we kind of know where they are. You know, Northwest Pennsylvania is obviously one of them. There's also, you know, coal, which is not really all that big right along the coast. But, you know, you've got Appalachia, which has a lot of coal. You've got Wyoming. You've got Southern Illinois with a kind of a strip of coal there. And this is going to be a big part of the Trumpian coalition. And we also have some kind of backsliding in this election, that there were fears of opposition to fracking, which may have driven away some voters in Texas. There was some hope that the Democrats could win Texas. Instead, many along the border moved to vote for Trump. Maybe some in Pennsylvania, it's less clear. But in general, these kind of carbon producing jobs are going to be good paying jobs that people really appreciate, right? So it's going to be difficult to get them to adjust, given that these are, you know, high paying jobs in rural areas. If they go away, people are uncertain. So the kind of required structural adjustments to decarbonize the economy are going to have big cost to these regions, and the electoral consequences may get worse. So this is an important topic, is what I'm trying to say. So are place-based policies the way to go? I think they are, but it's not easy. So this paper is going to focus on Northwest Pennsylvania. It proposes some alternative industries consistent with a Green New Deal, but there's obviously a lot of other regions. So I understand, you can't do everything in one paper, but obviously we're going to need a lot of different strategies for a lot of different regions. We're going to need a lot more papers like this one to address this problem. So there's a few different ways to deal with struggling regions. One would be sort of a laissez-faire approach, which I think is largely what the US has done historically, where you just don't do very much and you kind of let things degrade, and you get devastated regions, you get ghost towns, and you get resentful, angry voters, and these areas just get depopulated. So you can also try to invest. You can invest in kind of transition industries to create new jobs. This might be possible in Northwest Pennsylvania. It's along these rail corridors. It's going to be a lot harder in West Virginia, though there was some attempt to build roads there to try and spur investment. There's some tech industry in Pittsburgh, but you're still going to need people to migrate to Pittsburgh from other parts of Appalachia. So here's the road network they tried to build in Appalachia to try and spur economic development. So there were some attempts to invest in this region, which has been struggling for a while. Another policy might be to use federal fiscal policy. You could relocate federal spending and employment. So this is not what this paper is about, but this is something that one might think about. If you think about DC's housing market, it's going to be overpriced. Some federal employment needs to be close to DC, but you could move some to Baltimore if it needs to be commutable, or you could move some to Appalachia too, in Virginia and West Virginia. A lot of federal agencies could be moved out of DC. Nobody complains about the CDC in Atlanta. And with telework, there's less need for proximity. So I think this could be another option for place-based policies. Also, defense production, shouldn't be placed in all states, which it usually is. You hear about the planes that are manufactured with parts in every state. Instead, we should focus this kind of federal spending in areas where there's manufacturing excess capacity to try and help these struggling regions. And maybe we should think about something else. Maybe we need to think about another way. Maybe instead of just trying to subsidize business or encourage business to invest, maybe we should just provide an extensive welfare state and a safety net instead. So maybe we should provide Medicare for all, so people don't necessarily need jobs to get health care. Maybe we should have guaranteed care so that we provide some jobs for care workers, and also people can get care if they're elderly. So the elderly are going to remain in these regions, and so then they're going to need care when they're elderly. And so if we provide some care work employment, that could help as well, and provide jobs to working age people too. And then expand public employment and public priorities, solar panel installation, environmental projects, green retrofitting, and so on. And then just rely on fiscal multipliers, kind of local multipliers for these federal investments to provide jobs rather than trying to incentivize private business. So obviously this is easier said than done, but I think we should think about these alternative approaches to these struggling regions. So 5 minutes goes very quickly, so I'll just wrap up. But I'd love to see Don write a paper on another region. I know he knows a lot about Northwest Pennsylvania, but it'd be interesting to see this for other regions, and what are the costs and benefits to this approach versus other approaches. All right, thanks so much. So if you want to have a few seconds to respond, or you can wait till later, whatever you prefer.
Why don't I wait till later in the interest of getting the other papers out there, and we'll see where the discussion goes at the end.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so then we'll move on. Next, we'll have Christina, who will talk about economic stagnation and the infrastructure of care.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a paper that actually relates to the previous presentation in that it speaks to issues motivating, I think, trunked voters, and also speaks to economic transformation. And just a disclaimer that the views expressed by me are not necessarily the views of the World Bank. So this is a paper about, it's about gender, but it's also about political economy. So the motivation for this paper is first, an intense political focus on the care economy in 2020 that the pandemic has sort of laid bare. Another motivation is a recent article by the philosopher Nancy Fraser, who discusses the inherent contradictions of capitalism in the way it treats care work. And she writes that the crisis of care will not be resolved by tinkering with social policy. In fact, the path to its resolution can only go through a deep structural transformation of this social order. What is required above all is to overcome financialized capitalism's rapacious subjugation of reproduction to production, but this time without sacrificing either emancipation or social protection. This in turn requires reinventing the production-reproduction distinction and reimagining the gender order. It remains to be seen whether the result will be compatible with capitalism at all. Another motivating factor is the fact that most advanced economies, including the US, are undergoing something called secular stagnation, which is particularly true now in the pandemic. And secular stagnation, very simply, is the excess demand for savings that reduces real interest rates to negative territory, such that traditional monetary policies cannot rebalance the economy to full employment. And then another motivating factor that has also been alluded to are the instabilities in political economy of liberal Western democracies. So this includes the right-wing populist movements we've been seeing in various countries, including the US. So my paper is sort of a response to all of this. The objectives for my paper are to build the premise using standard economic reasoning and concepts that one fundamental instability in advanced economies and an important source of economic stagnation revolves around the supply of paid and unpaid care work in an economy. The other instability relates to climate change, which I do not discuss here. So in this paper, I define care work and an economy's care infrastructure, and I try to lay the beginning of a theoretical and empirical foundation for measuring and analyzing an economy's infrastructure of care. I demonstrate how expanding female economic opportunity relates to Bumble's cost disease and the stagnation of the care sector, both paid and unpaid. I summarize models and evidence to demonstrate how a stagnating care sector, due to occupational crowding, contributes to the current secular stagnation affecting most advanced economies. I also reinterpret conservative ideologies and conservative political economies and provide space and terminology for concerns about social reproduction and policymaking. And lastly, I develop policy principles for high-income liberal democratic societies that want to uphold both equality of opportunity and sustainable long-term economic growth. And so overall, I hope to help you and societies reimagine how education, healthcare, criminal justice, law enforcement, and military sectors could be transformed if gendered norms about care work were relaxed. So this paper speaks to various lines of literature. In the mainstream neoclassical literature, there's a lot of work looking at families and macroeconomics. It's a literature linking decisions about household formation, fertility, and labor supply to macroeconomic outcomes. And then also, I mentioned Nancy Fraser's paper, and Nancy Fulbray at UMass Amherst is publishing a book that's related in terms of my goals for this paper. It's called The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems. So the roadmap for this presentation is, first I will define care work and care infrastructure. Then I'm going to talk about how female economic opportunity relates to Bumble's cost disease and the care sector. Then I'll present models and evidence that show how an undiversified care infrastructure leads to economic stagnation. I then discuss conservative institutions and then policy principles for high-income liberal democracies that depend on human capital for growth. So care work in the care sector. I define care labor as all the human labor, as opposed to non-human labor, involved in providing a balance of nurture, challenge, and protection that contributes to the expansion of another human's or group of humans' holistic capacities, which includes physical, intellectual, social, and emotional flourishing. I also include protection of humans as a form of care work. So in my definition of the care sector, I include the military, law enforcement, and judicial sector. I also define care work as a subset of social reproduction. Social reproduction includes all aspects of culture making. That includes homemaking, writing, the arts, community building, religious and spiritual institutions. And I also define the care sector as consisting of sectors primarily concerned with care work and or social reproduction activities. And I do this for the purposes of future economic measurement and analysis. Unpaid care work is labor, and the homemaker is simply an unpaid occupation. Within a care sector, there are care services and non-care technical services. So the surgeon is in a care sector because the surgeon is in the health profession, but is providing non-care technical services, while the nurse or the physical therapist is actually providing care services. And then I also want to note that social justice issues can be reframed as unequal access to various types of care services. I also want to note that normative discussions about the value of social reproduction activities fall outside the boundaries of mainstream economic discourse. I also want to point out that care work can be thought of as an infrastructure. Why? Because it lowers costs on a massive scale for other parts of the economy. And it also provides important inputs. Similar to how a physical transportation infrastructure or a utilities infrastructure lowers costs of production for both households and businesses, care infrastructure lowers costs of the economy in various ways. So greater skill, education, and emotional capacities contribute to flexibility and resilience in times of crisis and shock. Better healthcare systems contribute to economic resilience. And better justice and law enforcement systems not only enforce contracts and lower transaction costs, they also support well-being and productivity of individuals, communities, and firms. I also want to present the idea that care infrastructure is often a common pool resource. And so the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom devoted her career to studying common pool resources, usually things like police departments or irrigation systems and the management of other natural resources. She defines common pool resources as systems that generate finite quantities of resource units so that one person's use subtracts from the quantity of resource units available to others. I also want to point out that there are various types of care infrastructure that qualify as a common pool resource. In the current pandemic, it is clear that intensive care unit beds are a common pool resource. Judicial time is a common pool resource. And I also want to argue that unpaid care time, usually provided by females, is now becoming a common pool resource. Ostrom also writes, the prediction of resource collapse is supported in very large, highly valuable open access systems when the resource harvesters are diverse, do not communicate, and fail to develop rules and norms for managing the resource. I am arguing that the supply of care labor has been becoming more expensive and scarce and are under conditions that are approaching resource collapse. I also want to point out that it's more difficult to directly measure and analyze a community's care infrastructure relative to other types of common pool resource goods. And this leads to other policy implications I'll discuss later. So what is Bumble's cost disease and how does it relate to the care sector? The economic intuition is very, I think, pretty simple. First, you have expanding educational and economic opportunity for females. In the US, this happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. So you have a structural transformation or reallocation of female time from unpaid to the paid sector. That also corresponds to a reallocation of labor from manufacturing and agriculture into services. With this is an increasing opportunity cost of a factor of production. This is female time. It is interacting with slowly changing gender norms of care and also interacting with the fact that there has been no productivity increase in the time for production of children or a lot of care services. And what that turns into is a cost disease in the paid and unpaid care sector with various ramifications. So this is just simply showing that the cost of education and medical care in the US has been skyrocketing relative to the cost of other goods. And Bumble's 1967 cost disease theory talks about how if the progressive sector, the non-progressive sector can lead to economic stagnation if the demand for services is actually income elastic. The demand increases with income and relatively price inelastic. And this is what you see with expanding healthcare costs, which I show here. You see that total health spending for the OECD has been increasing as a percentage of GDP, with the US as a particular outlier. And also OECD education spending has also been increasing per student. So here I want to show you that there's been an increasing opportunity cost of female non-working time. So these are trends from high-income countries. On the left, you see male and female educational attainment, male in the blue, female orange. And the gap, or the difference, is the green line. So there's been a decreasing gap in female educational attainment. With this progress, comes more female employment. And so you see the gender gap in employment in the high-income countries also decreasing over time. And the bottom shows where these females are going in terms of employment. They are predominantly going into the service sector. And these, the bottom bar chart shows the OECD average of the share employed in the service sector. I also want to point out there's a high opportunity cost for females to get educated. So the top panel makes it seem, so richer households are more likely to use informal childcare arrangements, because this chart shows that the highest tertile income households are more likely to use informal childcare. However, if you split it up by mother's education in the bottom, you actually see that mothers who are at the highest level of education are actually less likely to use informal childcare, suggesting that they're using formal childcare more. This, I am arguing, is another example of the high opportunity cost of educated females. Another factor I want to point out is that there's increasingly higher returns to uninterrupted experience in the skill-intensive nonlinear occupations, such as in tech or the innovation sector. So you see that over time, nonlinear occupations returns to education, that's the top table, increases significantly. Correspondingly, the penalties to part-time work increase a lot for the nonlinear occupations. Meanwhile, there are slow-changing gender norms of care work. On the top, for various countries, I show the average daily time spent in unpaid work in high-income countries, ordered by gender imbalance. On the left-hand side are the Scandinavian countries, and on the right-hand side, you see Southern European countries and high-income East Asian countries, South Korea and Japan. But even within the gender equal Scandinavian countries, the bottom figure shows that in terms of the duration of paid leave that men and women take, women are still overwhelmingly taking the majority of paid leave, showing there's still a gender imbalance even in the high gender equality countries. And I argue that there's a cost disease that's actually playing out in various aspects of the economy. Here I'll show you the paid sector. The top figure shows OECD public spending on family benefits and education by a child age. So actually spending for the youngest children has increased over time. Meanwhile, spending for the other child ages has been decreasing. I note this is because cohort sizes are shrinking due to fertility declines. So it's actually very striking that the public spending for children on 0 to 5 years is increasing. I'm arguing it is because female time has become more expensive, and because caring for young children is very labor intensive since they're not in school yet, the spending by governments on this has been increasing. Meanwhile, just to give a comparison, public expenditures on law, order, and defense sectors has been relatively fixed. Another piece of evidence for the cost disease in the unpaid sector is just declining total fertility rates in high-income countries, which we see on the left. And then also just documentation of average weekly hours of housework. This is from the US. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the promised technological innovations of appliances and other an importation of low-skilled domestic labor has actually not really helped the female unpaid work that much. So you do see a decline in average weekly hours of housework, but it's actually stagnated. And in fact, what you see is that most of the decline in aggregate is because women are less likely to become housewives and more likely to become ever married employed women. And in fact, the ever married employed women, if you look at their average weekly hours of housework, it hasn't moved that much at all over time. Okay, so we're getting close to 20 minutes. Okay, so let me quickly go through. So I just wanted to point out that a recent paper classified the the service sector into progressive versus stagnant services. And in this table, I point out that actually the progressive subsector is the sector that benefits from automation technologies. Meanwhile, the stagnant sector is highly correlated with what I define as the care sector. It is less likely to benefit from automation technologies because it just simply takes the same amount of time, or there isn't much of a decrease in time it takes to produce children or to provide care services. And then a question I want to pose is, are stagnant and progressive subsectors substitutable? If they are substitutable, then the cost disease is not a huge deal, as this paper argues. However, I'm arguing that the unpaid and paid care sector has productivity effects on other parts of the economy. Part of it is because the care sector is quite imperfectly substitutable with the progressive service sectors. So there's another section of my paper that goes through various models showing how declining fertility, stagnating female labor force participation, and occupational sorting by gender leads to all sorts of inefficiencies. So I will really just go very quickly through this. So I want to say a birth is a signal of future investment and future demand. Lower aggregate fertility leads to higher future savings and lower future investment and demand. Higher differential fertility, which is inequality of fertility, lowers aggregate educational attainment, also lowers productivity. And it also leads to higher income and wealth inequality, which also in itself leads to higher savings and lower investment and demand. So these are all factors that are exacerbating secular stagnation. Stagnating female labor force participation lowers aggregate output, leads to slower recoveries and lower male wages. And occupational sorting leads to lower productivity, lower wages, and fertility to shocks. I'll skip this. And I'll point to some cross-country differences that point to the role of publicly funded care infrastructure. You can actually see in aggregate that as fertility goes down, it also corresponds to lower gender gaps in schooling, lower gender gaps in employment. But if you look at cross-sectional variation in fertility versus labor force participation, it's actually positive. Those countries that allow females to participate in the labor force are also demonstrating higher fertility. It's a positive correlation, not a negative correlation. And I think this can be shown by dividing countries into the public care, the family infrastructure that it provides. So there's a previous book, a series of papers, divides European countries, Western countries into 4 categories. At the very top are social democratic Scandinavian countries with the highest level of family infrastructure. And at the very bottom are liberal countries like the US with low levels of support for the family. And I just look at the outcomes of the countries by the 4 types. And so, okay, so the big takeaway is that countries that have the lowest fertility also have the highest employment gender gap that corresponds with lower family infrastructure. I'll skip conservative institutions and I'll just summarize saying that I think all this evidence leads to principles for high-income liberal democracies that depend on human capital for growth. Government spending is key to lifting advanced economies out of stagnation. Investment in care infrastructure is more productive in ecosystems and economies in which human capital is the most important factor of production. And policies that are able to relieve the care responsibilities for very young children will be particularly productivity enhancing. Okay, so I'll refer you to the paper for more details, and I'll finish here.
All right, thanks. So next we'll have, is it Ju Yoon, who will discuss the paper?
Sure. Okay. Am I sharing? Can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Resume share. Yep. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to read this really rich paper by Christina. It was, I enjoyed it very much. I feel like I'm reading somebody's dissertation, but anyway, otherwise, it was a great honor to read this paper. And I suggest that you guys to read the paper. It was uploaded on the ASSA website. So I'm gonna just share some of my 2 cents by reading this paper. As you can imagine by just listening to her presentation, it just showed so much information, so much rich arguments and points and evidence. So it has a lot of information. This paper has a lot of information. But I want to just point out like a few points that are in the paper, and then I had some questions. The Baumel's theory of a cost disease. I'm a time use researcher, so in the time use research literature, there has been already evidence in the developed countries, in the very most developed countries, highly educated mothers already spend a lot of their time on childcare compared to low educated mothers. So like, are we seeing the evidence in a right way? So because it's already been shown in the literature. So I was wondering whether you know this fact. And then also the gender norms in the care sector. Is it distinctive? Is this gender norm only applying to the care sector? Isn't it applying to all sectors, not just the care sector? And I have some questions about the definitions and concepts, which Christina already have answered many of them, but I wonder why. I can understand why paid care and then unpaid care together. However, I think it's very distinctive and a very different paid care and unpaid care. One is getting paid, the other one is not getting paid. One is included in GDP measure in national income accounts. However, the other one is not. So I understand why you treat unpaid care workers, the housewives, as a separate occupation, but can we separate them out and then still see the same argument? And you also took a very broader definition, which I have not seen in any other paper in the care infrastructure or care work literature. So caring labor included, because you wanted to include a protection and the care sector, the 3 care sectors that I have some questions is the military operations and law enforcement and judiciary systems. And like what's your reasoning to include those? You have included those in the beginning of the paper, but in any of the evidence or any of the points you mentioned in the later of the paper did not really have any reference to these sectors. So I wonder why you have included it in the beginning, but like not mentioning in the letter of the paper. And also I have I wanted to understand a little more about the undiversified care infrastructure. What does it really mean? You have presented here and there in the paper, but I think it'd be great to have a succinct definition of like what it means. Does it mean that it's very female oriented or female dominant sector? Is that why? But then like military operations is not really female dominant sector. So I had a hard time understanding what undiversified care infrastructure means. And also, as you mentioned, the doctors, they are in the care sector. Oh, I see the typo. But anyway, care sector, only one T. So there is a great overlaps between sector and occupations, but I think it'd be good to like tease them out in the paper. Also, there was a little mentioning of the relationships between the paid work and the unpaid work in the paper, but I want to see more in the paper. And then also gender norm on the unpaid work. There have been a lot of evidence in literature, especially in sociology, that there has been a gender convergence in unpaid care time, unpaid housework in most developed countries. So like, does that still apply to your argument? And you have, I think your paper is broader than just focusing on human capital. So I immediately thought of Amartya Sen's capabilities. Is like, can you apply that theory to your paper? And then also like, why not breaking down the paid care work and then unpaid care work, and then treat them separately. And within the unpaid care sector, unpaid care work or unpaid care activities, housework is very different from caring for children or caring for the elderly. And Nancy Fulbright, as you mentioned, who was my dissertation advisor, has a tremendous there has been a lot of studies about like why these two are different, even though they are all lumped in the unpaid care. So can we separate them out and then like see even more? And caring work is very different and very distinctive from housework, for example. So I want to see a little more of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I try to keep people on time. I just want to hear some from the audience. 20 minutes and 5 minutes is just very, very little time, but unfortunately those are our constraints. All right, so next is me. I'll be talking to you about funding the Green New Deal and stabilizing an unstable economy, functional finance, nominal income targeting. All right. So everybody knows about a Green New Deal. The current frameworks for financing a Green New Deal would be largely through deficit spending, using kind of traditional financing methods that are already available in the US. Naturally, this kind of program to be effective is going to require spending on the order of trillions of dollars. That's just to do the direct program of decarbonization, but usually Green New Deal programs also have some kind of social aspect to address the people that are going to be harmed by these structural changes to the economy. So in parts of the U.S. or parts of the world that are going to be focused on carbon production, like we talked about a little bit before, you want to have some kind of thinking to address what's going to happen to those regions. And so that's going to add on to the price tag, probably several trillions, to be able to construct a kind of political coalition to pass this legislation. At the current moment, it obviously is far from being passed, and so we need to think about ways to have a politically popular program. So one aspect of it is the environmental aspect, but also the degree of spending also leads to people being skeptical that the U.S. can afford all that new spending. And so I'm going to propose a policy framework that I think can provide for a better way to construct a political coalition to have a Green New Deal. So this program would be based on functional finance. So this is based on Lerner's 1943 paper. The government policy should be judged based on the results of the policy, that we should construct policies that are good for people, not whether it's based on sound financing, public finance principles. So we shouldn't worry about the effect on the deficit. We should worry about whether a policy is good or not. So Lerner lays out three principles. First is that government should use fiscal policy to keep the total rate of spending equal to what can be produced at current prices. So basically, you should have macroeconomic stabilization so that you don't get inflation or unemployment. The other is that the government should borrow money only if the public wants government bonds. So otherwise, you just should print money. And so that's rule number 3. You should just print money to stabilize the economy as needed. You inject or destroy money as required to stabilize the economy. And if this results in larger budget deficits, then you shouldn't really worry about it. So often critiques of functional finance center around rule number 3. What happens if debt becomes excessive? In theory, you can address that by raising taxes or shrinking the money supply or something like that. But it's easier said than done once you run into a situation where you have high debt. And so, if you run into a high inflation situation due to the need to monetize debt because it's politically difficult to raise taxes, then that can be inconsistent with rule number 1, macroeconomic stabilization. And so I'm going to propose that the U.S. should just set U.S. interest rates to 0%. So all bonds should carry a 0% interest rate. And then there's essentially no cost to rolling over debt. So debt can be issued and there's no interest carried with it. And so then any level of spending can be achieved, no matter how many trillions of dollars we need to spend for the Green New Deal or for associated social programs. We can spend it because it's financially costless. And that's going to ensure that rule number 3 isn't an issue. So we can have a debt to GDP ratio of any level because the debt is costless financially. And also it's going to help with rule number 2, since you can issue bonds at will and trade them for money because everything is a 0% interest rate. Then it's going to also provide for the public's desire for bonds versus money, satisfy money demand. So there's also a nominal income target that I'll get to in a second. So in terms of the permanent zero interest rate policy, how would that work? The Fed's going to buy all bonds, so they carry no interest. So you issue a bond that is worth $100. The Fed will buy it until its price is $100. And so if there's insufficient private sector demand, then the Fed is just going to purchase that so that it carries a 0% interest rate. And then the Fed will also just sell Treasury debt at will at $100. So the Fed is going to buy and sell, then the Treasury will just issue debt as needed. And so then, everything's going to be interchangeable. The Treasury can issue debt at any maturity because all debt is functionally the same, and the Fed will buy it at any time. So all government liabilities, money, and Treasury bonds are all going to carry a 0% interest rate. So you might already be asking yourself, well, what happens if you get some inflation as a result? So you're printing, people can just sell their bonds to the Fed. The money supply increases a lot. Or people are not going to hold these bonds. They're going to buy other assets that are going to be inflationary, things like that. So I'll get to the stabilization in a little bit, but let's just assume that we can hit that 0% target. So what does that allow us to do? Well, we can think about green electricity investments. Obviously, green energy is kind of the low-hanging fruit of any Green New Deal. And so things like solar panels and wind power, solar power is going to be price competitive today. The marginal cost or the operating cost is basically 0. And so then there'd essentially be no financial cost because the government can simply purchase these and it's costless at 0% interest rate. So they're going to issue bonds, however many are needed to buy these wind turbines and solar panels. And then the debt is just rolled over at 0%. So since you have zero operating costs, you basically get free electricity forever. You know, a lot of times the Green New Deal is thought about in terms of scarcity, that the government's coming to take your hamburger or take your gasoline car. But here we have a possibility of kind of super abundance. So we can also overbuild solar, which is one proposal to try and deal with intermittency. You just build lots and lots of solar, which is very cheap and getting cheaper every day. And then you can just turn it off when it's not needed. So in the hot summer days, you know, if you have too much sun, you just turn it off and then it's available to run on cloudier days. Note that you can also build batteries for intermittency. Because they also have similar cost structure, that they have a high upfront fixed cost that you could deficit spend, and then there's basically zero operating costs. You know, we have a possibility really of having a massive investment program. We can just you know, have the whole Southwest covered in solar panels. And build transmission lines. You know, those have kind of similar economics. So we have the possibility to have electricity so cheap it's not worth metering potentially. Now, the 0% financing is also going to allow you to do other kind of large fixed costs, things like research and development. You can spend on things like infrastructure, doing more rail, things like electrical charging stations, and so on. So getting to zero is really important. You know, even though interest rates are pretty low today, getting to zero really opens up a whole lot of possibilities to change the framing of the Green New Deal to one of abundance rather than one of scarcity. All right, so how are we going to stabilize the economy? What if we get inflationary pressures from this? And so the idea is to use fiscal policy, which now is relatively unconstrained, to stabilize things. So we're going to send checks to households. So you may have heard of the Somm rule, which is, this is kind of a supercharged Somm rule. Claudia Somm proposed to have checks sent in cases of recession. Here we'd send checks anytime the economy is going to slow down. And it would automatically go out. And then we're going to shrink the size of the checks being sent to households if the economy is inflating. So, you know, rather than trying to very indirectly affect the economy through monetary policy, we know that monetary policy is less effective near the zero lower bound. We need to use the fact that we have very low interest rates to just go whole hog, go straight to zero. And then we can simply stabilize the economy with fiscal policy. So we've seen the effectiveness of fiscal policy through the CARES Act, sending out lots of money, which has helped blunt the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And so we should just make this a regular thing, that the government is going to send out checks to households, and then those checks are going to vary based on economic conditions. So we'll send out more if the economy is slowing, and send out smaller checks if the economy is overheating, and then we can keep the economy on an even keel. So to be more specific, I would propose something like a nominal income target. So this is popular today, is popular largely along kind of market monetarists or kind of new breed of monetarists, though, you know, both Tobin and Mead thought about this as a good way to think about internal balance from a Keynesian perspective. So basically you would say that, you know, the economy grows, say, at 5% on average in terms of nominal GDP or nominal income. And so then we want to stabilize along those lines. And so, you know, we obviously failed at that after the Great Recession. We had a very weak recovery. And so this kind of rule would automatically keep the economy on an even keel. And so since we can just send out checks whenever nominal income growth is too slow, then we can essentially end recession. So as soon as the economy starts slowing down, we're just going to send out lots more checks. And so we can essentially end recessions, because if you know, the economy is slow to recover, you just send out more checks. Eventually people will spend it. And if the economy is overheating, we'll just send out smaller checks to try and cool down the economy. So that's specifically how, you know, we're going to stabilize the economy. You know, I think it's important, if we're proposing a radical framework, which I think this is, to change the way we conduct monetary and fiscal policy. It's our responsibility to be specific about what exactly is going on. So if there's a negative shock and growth is only 4% in nominal income, then we're going to send out checks worth 1% of national income. And then if inflation becomes a problem, then nominal GDP growth is 7%, then maybe we'll shrink the transfers by 2%. So you can see that it's important to have a relatively high level of taxation. So in terms of these checks, they're not exactly free in a global sense, because if you have higher taxes, then it's going to allow you to send out larger amounts of checks. So it would be good even to have relatively regressive taxes like a value-added tax. That's going to be rebated in a lump sum to all households. And so it's going to have an equalizing effect on the distribution of income. So in some sense, we can have something like a UBI policy here. And so the more taxes you have that are taking money out of the economy, the more scope you have to then send out larger checks, because taxes are going to shrink national income growth. So how does that relate to this specifically? Well, if we think about carbon taxes, those are a lot of Green New Deal supporters are skeptical about carbon taxes. They're generally unpopular in the US. At least they haven't been passed yet wherever they've been tried. They're generally regressive on their own. Because in general, the poor spend a larger share of their income on carbon-related activities like driving versus the rich. And so one proposal is to have a dividend program so that carbon tax revenues are automatically rebated to households. And so then it becomes a progressive policy, because the rich still spend more on carbon-related activities than the poor do. And so if you rebate a carbon dividend in lump sum, then that's going to make it a progressive policy. And so notice that this proposal for functional finance nominal income targeting is going to automatically implement a carbon dividend, because the carbon taxes are going to take away income from households. They're going to slow nominal income growth, and so then they'll automatically be rebated. So this should provide some additional political support in that it's a clear way to get to carbon taxes. And so carbon taxes are going to be important to raise the prices of carbon. We're going to be able to invest in things like green energy, but in terms of people's private automobiles, we need to provide a way to encourage them to switch to electrification. And so we could have a kind of regulatory approach to just ban gas cars, or we can have this approach that's going to encourage people to shift away to electric cars through raising the price of carbon. So I think we need a kind of all of the above approach to decarbonize the economy as quickly as possible. And this provides a way to make carbon taxes more popular by automatically providing a benefit to households from higher carbon taxes. So they're not worried about a decline in their standard of living from carbon taxes. So there's another part, I've got all kinds of ideas. So another part of this, which I don't think is kind of core to the proposal, but I think would be very useful, would be a job opening guarantee. So it's a bit different than traditional job guarantee programs you might hear about. So rather than having a separate program, which is called the job guarantee, and separate government employment, the government would just open lots of new job openings. And the idea would be to target kind of struggling regions like Appalachia, or regions that are dependent on carbon production, to try and open new jobs there to provide employment for people in those areas. So I think it's important to have this government pay scale where you have a way to finance this given 0% interest rates, that issuing government liabilities is costless. And so then you want to have a government pay scale because you want to attract skilled workers in the trades or engineers or managers. And so you don't want to just pay a kind of flat wage like $15 an hour, because a lot of these jobs that are required to build green infrastructure or decarbonize the economy command much higher wages at kind of union pay scales. And so you'll want to have those be government employment, but this will both provide a way to deal with unemployment in the lagging regions, unemployment among oil workers, unemployment among coal workers, so that now the government's going to issue lots of new job openings for things related to decarbonization or other societal priorities. We could think about Medicare for all. We could think about care work. So the government now can really provide an extensive social safety net. And so, we can hire a lot of people in government employment, and that will help ease the transition for these sectors or these regions that are going to be adversely affected by the transition away from carbon. So, I think this would be really very, very helpful to help ease the Green New Deal. We saw that there are, people that work in the carbon producing economy, are very skeptical of it. And I think this would ease their concerns about a lack of jobs in the new green economy. All right, so in the interest of time, I'll wrap up. I have some other slides. I think we'll get questions on them, but in the interest of time, I'll just start wrapping up there. Whether this is MMT or not. So we'll save that for the questions. But I've proposed a functional finance nominal income target. Basically, it's going to set 0% interest rates for all government money and debt, so that now fiscal policy is always costless financially. It's going to target a stable growth rate for nominal income. That's going to end macroeconomic instability. So you're going to end recessions and inflation, and then now you can finance any Green New Deal required. You've got free unlimited green electricity. The only cost there is going to be, that you have to transfer resources from other sectors. So if you're spending on this green electricity, it's going to tend to drive up nominal income growth. So you might want to do this in the transition period when you're kind of ramping up to the new policy of FFMNIT. But other than the need for that will crowd out other spending, there's not going to be any financial cost to providing kind of unlimited green electricity. You'll get an automatic carbon dividend from carbon taxes, so that you can raise the price of carbon for the kind of activities that direct government intervention is going to be less useful at doing. We want to have decentralized transition from carbon production than we want to have carbon taxes, and this should provide some political support, and then job opening guarantee, so that there's multiple job openings being opened even in struggling areas, so that you provide a transition for these struggling regions or struggling sectors of the economy when you have decarbonization. And so, this provides a lot of possibility to finance all the trillions and trillions of dollars that we're going to need to spend on the Green New Deal, and provide for these other benefits: macroeconomic stabilization, an extensive welfare state and safety net, and so on. All right, thanks so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments. And so then the discussant will be Don. So whenever you want to start.
All right. Thank you very much, Gabe. It's great to read a contribution to the conversation on how do we finance a Green New Deal. I think the proposal in this paper is a radical and serious one, and therefore a very welcome contribution. It's really, as you note in the paper, Gabe, it's an ABBA learner functional finance model on steroids. You set the interest rate at 0 and everything is free. I think that many, perhaps most generally economics literate readers will have questions about this. And it would be good to carve out a little bit of space in the paper to flesh that out a little bit more, i.e. Not assume that the reader is going to have a familiarity with these literatures. And maybe we'll get to some of this if we get a chance to discuss its relationship to modern monetary theory a little bit later. But for example, how can the Treasury sell bonds with 0% interest? Why would investors want these bonds? It's basically putting money under a mattress. I had a question reading the paper about the relationship between the Treasuries market and the markets for other bonds, corporates, municipals, et cetera. But in your presentation, you clarified that by specifying that the Fed would purchase all bonds until their interest rates fell to 0. In terms of the relationship with fiscal policy, the question gets raised vis-a-vis functional finance of how successfully the federal government can exercise the required degree of control over taxes and spending, in this case, spending on the Green New Deal. It's not clear to me from your paper how spending on, for example, technology investments, renewable technologies, grid technologies, et cetera, would relate to the baseline income targeting payments in terms of their effect on aggregate demand. But there's a tax side to learners policy or theory, certainly, And I felt that was a little underspecified here and could use a little bit of beefing up. The government would have to decide how much investment it wants to make in climate change mitigating and adapting investment. And the same would be true for the job openings guarantee, and how that would relate to other kind of spending going on. There's a section in the paper about the right discount rate, kind of an optimal discount rate for fighting climate change. I didn't see that in your presentation, and I was comfortable with that because in the paper I wasn't clear with how it related to the rest of the paper and what the punchline was. Other than permitting a costless government financing of green investments, why would 0% be that appropriate rate, that optimal rate, if indeed that's what you're arguing, and how it matters to the overall analysis. On the other hand, I really like the job openings guarantee and the way you linked it to the what you referred to as lagging economies in discussing my paper. I thought that that's a nice piece that could tie in beautifully with the kind of regional planning and analysis that I think we need to do. You might think about specifying training, because the empirical literature on job creation, job programs, shows pretty clearly that you have to have training, and that training has to be holistic. You have to provide people with childcare. You have to make sure they have transportation in order for it to work. It also has to be linked to employers who are willing to hire them. And there, your point about not relying utterly on private business incentives, but perhaps federally sponsored programs themselves could be a nice one. So again, it's a good paper. It's a welcome contribution to the literature, and I look forward to a chance to hear what the audience has to say about it as well.
Thanks so much. I have some comments. I really appreciate those comments as well, but I'll save them in the interest of time for the discussion so we can get everybody involved. All right, so we'll continue on with Hendrik. He'll be talking about comparing the ecological thinking of Marx and Veblen. Who had the better foresight?
All right, good morning. This paper is a work of love, two economists that I'm very fond of, and two economists who have actually provided incredible insight into ecology, into thinking about the environment, something that we tend to forget. So in this paper, what I tried to do is bring out the strength, the amazing foresight that these two economists presented. And I try to contrast them a bit because they are somewhat different, although they are also similar in a very fundamental way that I will point out here. I begin the paper basically, and I'm just going to speak here. I'll bring in I'll share the screen later with some PowerPoints where necessary. But what kind of motivated me on all of this is that today's economists, and that includes, unfortunately, many, many heterodox economists, do an awful lot of economic analysis ignoring the environment. And this came out so strongly after the crisis 2007-2009 recession, and now again with the COVID crisis. There's all this emphasis on restoring the economy, on getting people back to work, on restoring growth. And that, again, is across the board, even post-Keynesians focused on, we argued a lot about how to restore growth and how to restore the economy, but we simply ignored the fact, and there's the interesting case that, I bring in the paper itself, and that is basically during the Great Recession and the slow recovery from that Great Recession, the environmental conditions continued to worsen. That is, we had an incredibly slow recovery since 2009, yet the environment suffered tremendously. So the environmental issue is there. It's hitting us over the head right now, and we're not really addressing it in almost all of the branches of economics. And what I find interesting about this is essentially, despite, a few dissident voices and so forth, that we actually know a lot, and that 150 years ago with Marx and 100 years ago with Veblen, these issues were being brought to the forefront. And I argue in the paper that these were prominent economists. Granted, they were not mainstream necessarily, and they took a lot of criticism from mainstream economists, but they were prominent. They were well known. Remember, Veblen was even offered the presidency of the American Economic Association back in his day. So these were well-known economists bringing up this issue. Why have we forgotten this? And what did they contribute? I think it's time to bring back a lot of thinking that they presented and highlight that. And that's what I try to do in this paper. I try to bring in some of the interesting aspects of what they present. Now, the thing that is important for both Veblen and Marx, and this is where Marx really made his big contribution, is the basic concept of the materialist dialectic. That is the huge factor that allowed both Veblen and Marx to emphasize ecology. And that is the main reason, I think, why mainstream economics and even post-Keynesians often ignore the environment. The materialist dialectic forces us to think about change, what drives change, and what the barriers, the stresses, the conflicts, the contradictions are that shape this process of change. And once you start thinking that way, well, the environment obviously fits in. It becomes very natural to bring that into your analysis. When we engage in static analysis, which is what we tend to do most often in the mainstream, in our profession, and I'm saying our as a large group, and when we bring in the static analysis, again, it's very easy to ignore the environment because that is looked at as something separate, long-term, and what have you. So it is the idea of the materialist dialectic that endogenizes the environment into the analysis of economics and forces you to endogenize that. And that is, again, really the main contribution that Marx brings to ecology and led him to be an ecological economist. He brings up many, many ecological issues. And let's focus on some of those. Again, the issue again of unity. And here, let me quote Marx here. This is from his Grundrisse. It is not the unity of living and active humanity with the natural inorganic condition of the metabolic exchange with nature, and hence their appropriation of nature, which requires an explanation or is the result of a historic process, but rather the separation between these inorganic conditions of human existence and this active existence, a separation which is completely posited only in the relation of wage labor and capital. That is what he's saying essentially is, the problem isn't that there's a unity between humanity and nature. The problem is that we have separated the two, that we separate them and then focus on one aspect and forget the unity of humanity with nature. I can quote Engels here. Engels again and Marx, very difficult to separate those two. They work together very closely. And this has to do with essentially the dominance of nature. This is telling us that this attitude that we tend to have, and this will be very important when we think about Veblen later, the attitude that we have that we, in a sense, are here to exploit nature, and this is what humans do. Engels again provides this, again, very, very nice quote. Let us not, however, flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human victories over nature. For each such victory, nature takes its revenge on us. Each victory, it is true, in the first place brings about the results we expected, but in the second and third places, it has quite different unforeseen effects, which only too often cancel the first. Thus, at every step, we are reminded that we by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside nature, but that we, with flesh, blood, and brain, belong to nature, exist in its midst. That is the strength of the message of Marx and his role in ecology. Another thing that I want to point out here, and this is incredibly insightful on the part of Marx that is worth remembering. He wrote at length about rent. Again, some difficult chapters in Capital on rent. But when we think about fundamentally what he was doing is he was contesting Malthus's and Ricardo's especially model of rent. Remember, Ricardo presented this model of rent as the gain over and above the returns to the lowest quality land. So if you had higher quality land, you collected rent. So he explained rent in the form of different qualities of land. Marx contested that directly in a dialectic fashion and in such an important way that it reminds us how ecologically he was motivated. He said, Ricardo was wrong in assuming land had different qualities, as if this was some kind of a fixed quality to the land. Marx brought out a lot of research also from Justus von Liebig, who did early work in analyzing soil, showing that the quality of land is a variable. It is not a fixed factor, as Ricardo assumed in his analysis. In other words, it's endogenous. That is, we can improve the soil, we can let it wither. It's an ecological issue that must be dealt with, and easy to see from a materialist dialectic perspective, but from neoclassical analysis or even classical analysis, Ricardo didn't see it that way. He took different forms of land. This is good land, that's bad land, as if that's some kind of a given. Marx, you can see, brings it in. It's a variable that we can change. In fact, we are part of nature. We influence nature. What we do with the land influences. That led him to that famous ecological rift concept that he introduces to ecology. And that is, especially with the growth of capitalism, the spread of capitalism through imperialism throughout the world, we end up, in a sense, depleting soils and not returning the nutrients to the soil, because we take what grows on the soil and ship it halfway around the world. And he uses the words, and we dump it in the Thames in Britain, instead of returning it to the soil in the American Midwest or wherever the goods were coming from, the food products were coming from. That he calls the ecological rift. It is a structural element of capitalism that destroys the environment. So, and again, a very important contribution in that sense. So let me move on here in the essence of time here to Thorstein Veblen now, and that's important. Where does Veblen fit in on this? So we take that basic idea of the materialist dialectic and realize that Veblen actually thought along the lines of the materialist dialectic. He looks at society as historical, the big difference being he emphasizes institutions. Remember, he is attributed with being the founder of the American Institutionalist School. But again, his thinking is entirely Marxian when we think about the dialectic. He looks at a moving, complex system. In fact, he was sufficiently interdisciplinary that many social scientists think of Veblen as a sociologist rather than even an economist. He was across the board in analyzing the evolution of human society. On top of that, and why he contributed very directly some incredible insight on ecology that we can still use today, in fact, should use. We haven't progressed much since Veblen's observations, quite honestly. He comes from a background of farming. He was raised in the American Midwest. We probably all know the story of being raised in a family of Norwegian immigrants on a farm, born in Wisconsin. Ultimately, his family ended up purchasing land very inexpensively in Minnesota, which is why he ended up basically being raised in Minnesota and beginning college there. They purchased land at a very nice price because the earlier owners of the land had depleted it. That is what Veblen came to call the American plan. That is, you take the resources, you milk them for what you can, you exploit them, and you move on. So people took land in the Midwest, some under the Homestead Act, others simply through purchase, used it, produced, And when the land ran out, they moved further west, who knows, moved on, essentially. And his family was able to accumulate, with relatively little money, a large acreage. Being from a Norwegian background, if you know anything about Norway, it's very hard to farm there. It's not a very hospitable climate. You really worked your resources and maintained them very carefully. That was an element of survival. So they came to the Midwest, they restored the land, had a relatively prosperous farm to where the Veblen family sent all of their children, women and men, to college. So they did well, but he understood this, what he called the American plan: exploit as fast as you can and then move on. He spent really much of his writing, his career, in explaining why this happens. What are the institutions that lead to this? One of the important contributions of Veblen, over and above the use of a dialectic approach to economics, one of his big contributions is essentially looking at human behavior. And he was very familiar with psychology as it was being developed at that time, sociology, thinking about society. And he noted, very interestingly, that all human beings have various behavioral possibilities. He talked about his 5 instincts. And, again, people have contested those, saying those aren't really instincts. He used the term instinct. It doesn't matter. Let's call them human tendencies. We all have the tendencies to be, for example, predators, to be curious, to emulate, to work, to provide, and to be parents. So parental bent, emulation, workmanship, idle curiosity are basic, and predation are basic characters. We're all capable of any of those 5 things, and we all do some of all of those 5 things at different points in life. What determines this is the institutional structure of society. What are the motivations here? How society is organized? What are our opportunities? What are our barriers? What conditions are we facing? And he used that kind of thinking as to why is it that people in the Midwest, Americans, didn't take care of the soil, didn't take care of the resources. He looked at forestry, he looked at farming, he looked at mining, and most of this was in his final work, and I do want to plug that a little bit. It's a work that's not often looked at with Veblen, and it is called Absentee Ownership. It is his last book, 1923, that most deeply delves into ecology. He has separate chapters on farming, on mining, on forestry, and looks in great detail at how these industries operated. And let me focus just again in the element of time. I'm running short here. Let me focus specifically on farming. And he brings forth an idea which is so current. In fact, you're finally here in the United States starting to see a better analysis of how the basic industry, big ag, agriculture works in this country. What is the institutional structure? How does it function? How is it organized? Here's Veblen writing 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, 1923, but he actually wrote even before that on this specifically. But he talks about how farmers were caught between monopolistic merchants, the suppliers. And we can talk about seeds, we can talk about cattle feed, we can talk about equipment, the suppliers of the goods that the farmers needed to produce on the one hand, and then how they sold their production on the other end, the buyers of the grains. Back in Nebraska, I taught in University of Nebraska for 28 years, so we're familiar with this. The farmers all hated the elevator companies, they hated the railroads, and they hated the banks, okay? Well, the farmer was caught between that. Suppliers on the one hand, who were monopolistic firms, these were not perfectly competitive firms, charged high prices for inputs, and then you had monopolistic firms buying the products on the other hand and providing the critical services to bring these goods to market. The farmer was squeezed in that. So Veblen, in his observation, of course the farmer abused the soil. He had no choice. Again, this is his understanding of institutional frameworks of the structures of economies. Think of how relevant that is. It wasn't many years ago that we were still teaching in Principles of Economics how farming is an example of a perfectly competitive industry. Here was Veblen writing in 1923, seeing exactly what was happening, and this was nothing related to a perfectly competitive society. This was a monopolistic organization that was prone to abuse of resources. And again, he even mentioned, and this is his incredible insight, he even mentions that the system forces the farmer to invest in the land, to buy the equipment, but the ultimate buyers of the product simply pay a price. In other words, all of the reproduction, all of the capital, not just the labor, but the capital was exploited by the system. And this is, of course, exactly where we are in big ag, in modern agriculture. And we can even think of this as an extension, and I'm thinking of the earlier paper on reproduction by Christina, and the idea that of the exploitation is not just labor, it's all forms of the production process, any way to gain the surplus. Think of Uber today, right? You have to buy your own car, you provide your own car, and it's your problem to make do with that. He was explaining this for the farming industry, and this led to exploitation of nature because the farmer had little choice. It's the system that generates the exploitation. And that is really the contribution of Veblen. I want to end with that as an understanding. What does this all mean? Well, a couple of important points here is essentially that nature under capitalism continues to be exploited. The system supports this structure, and it tells us a little bit about how difficult it is. Veblen put the details on this revolution that Marx foresaw coming out of the dialectic. Veblen, of course, is well known for not predicting a revolution. He kind of left it open. He was kind of non-committal, was criticized for that. Why don't you commit to where the society is going? He was non-committal because basically he was not that optimistic. He realized under the institutional structure how difficult change would be. And again, Don, your ideas are very valuable in this sense. How do we get around this structure? And how do we get progress when in fact individualism leads us to be destructive, essentially, and the system makes us individualistic and not look beyond our own immediate interest? How do we get around? That's Veblen's contribution. It's quite a challenge, and I interpret Veblen as saying we're in deep trouble and we need to find ways. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. So next we have John Wissman, who will discuss the paper. You're muted. You're muted. Yes.
Where did John go?
There you go.
Okay. Hendrik, for some time, I've admired you for your well-crafted and insightful work. But in this case, if my comments are mostly critical, it's with the hope that you might take this project to the same high level of the things I've had the privilege to read of yours in the past. Because Marx and Veblen's analyses focused principally on capitalism, it's understandable that their notes on ecological destruction would emphasize capitalism's role. But I suspect that as keen historians, had they explored ecological devastation more fully, they would have seen it not as just unique to capitalism. Foragers hunted species into extinction. Ever since the Neolithic Revolution, there's been slash and burn agriculture, deforestation, soil exhaustion, and polluted waterways endangering drinking water. So the question is, do Marx and Veblen claim that capitalism causes yet more severe ecological devastation proportionately than other social formations? And if so, how? You could express the intent of your investigation, I believe, with greater clarity. Presumably, it's to go beyond a mere comparative exposition of the respective views on ecology to probe why they were led to take up the issue. Perhaps a good place to start is that both Marx and Veblen cast their investigatory nets well beyond what Marx called the sphere of circulation, the principal focus of classical and neoclassical economics on markets. Accordingly, I believe you're right to nest your analysis within their broad theories. But to do this within the limitations of an article requires expositional economy. Yet, your first three sections don't address the topic at all. You address Marx's system first, and I find you give too much importance to dialectics. Marx, in fact, used the term sparingly. You offer the passages from Marx's, you offer a few passages from Marx's work to support your claims, and most are from secondary sources. You surprisingly produce a passage from Engels, The Dialectics of Nature, where he asserts that humans are not lords dominating nature, but part of nature. This is important insofar as since Genesis, the dominant Western view has been that the earth is given by God for human domination. Something similar to this can be found in Marx's early philosophical manuscripts, but it's much less prominent in his later work. But given your attention to Engels, should you be comparing Marx, Engels, and Veblen? Moving to Veblen, you write, Veblen's approach to economics was not radically different from Marx's materialist dialectic perspective. And much of what you write on Veblen uses the term dialectics to describe his approach. But Veblen attacked Marx's use of dialectics and saw it as stemming from Hegel's muddled metaphysics. For Veblen, dialectics was a pre-Darwinian and therefore unscientific concept. Arguably, wastefulness has two major sources in Veblen. First, profit-driven industrial predation, which is not so different from Marx, and you address it extensively as found in his last work, Absentee Ownership. Second, to which you give less attention, is the role of everyone's emulation of the wasteful consumption behavior of the leisure class. But did Marx and Veblen really have any substantial analysis of ecological devastation? You provide little evidence. My own recollection is that Marx had little more to offer than did John Stuart Mill. Both made mention of it, but never really addressed it systematically. For both Marx and Mill, competition requires that to survive, firms must do everything possible to keep down cost, including despoiling the environment. Veblen, on the other hand, did offer something unique. Predatory culture, and especially its expression as capitalism, devalues all socially beneficial means such as work and community for achieving social and self-respect, and leaves nothing in its place but wasteful, conspicuous consumption. But was Veblen really concerned with ecology, or instead waste? They need not be the same thing. A further critical comment is that your essay is located in the considerable ongoing discourse concerning ecological views individually of Marx and Veblen. But I've not seen the comparison you're doing, so I look forward to your further development.
You're muted. You're muted again.
Only one more comment. Finally, I don't think your attacks on the mainstream are appropriate for this article. What would be appropriate, if true, is how Marx and Veblen's theories offer superior theoretical frameworks for addressing the ecological question. But that must be demonstrated. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much. So we've got about 11 or 12 minutes. So why don't we go through the questions and then we can have some discussion if there's any comments from the authors or the discussants or other other things we want to discuss. So let's start with a question for Christina. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Could you elaborate on how or why you define military operations as care work? Who do you refer to? Most definitions of care work from feminist economics refer to characteristics like relationality, vulnerability, emotionality, and so on. And I see none of these in the sphere of military operations. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. And I also typed a response, so you can read that too. But just very quickly, I just wanted to say, I wanted to do it for economic measurement and analysis reasons. The justification for law enforcement and military spending is often due to reasons of infrastructure and protection for the functioning of the rest of the economy. And I want to link that to spending on care infrastructure too.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've got a couple questions for Don. Is your case study area part of the Great Lakes Consortium?
Yes, it is. And the consortium addresses a number of issues. It has not addressed the issue directly of lakeshore wind, to my knowledge. There may be some stuff out there that I'm not aware of, but I don't think that it does get into that. Thanks, Ann.
I should read the authors too. That was from Ann Davis, and the question for Christina was from Corina Dengler. So next we have a question from Ruth Indek. Don, I very much like your idea of regionalizing the Green New Deal and making it more specific. You said that big business and labor people were disinterested in your plan. Were they strongly opposed? Which people were interested? Unemployed? Did you talk to any Trump supporters? And what would be the possibilities for requiring new jobs to be unionized, or would that be determined by whether that type of job is unionized already in a non-New Deal context?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I want to focus, there's a number of questions in there, and given the time constraints, I want to focus on the issue of the attitude of regional business toward the kind of scenario building and Green New Deal participation I'm proposing. You have to. I think that you have to look at business in across sectors and across regions as having evolved during the course of the neoliberal period, a set of organizational capabilities and market connections and linkages that integrate business operations with cheap local labor and in many respects with global markets, both for sourcing and, in the case of manufacturing, often for sales. And what is integrative for capital in this context tends to be disintegrative for regions. It means that businesses in manufacturing have a very light local footprint. They're there for the cheap labor, maybe for some ancillary products and supply chains and expertise, but mostly they're focused on buying and selling globally, and they can move anytime. And the poorer the region is, in a lot of ways, for them, the better. The same thing is true for, in certain respects, for service industries as well. And I think for that reason that my approach suggests that we have to view this in terms of class struggle, or maybe an eco-class struggle, that the workforces and communities of regions across this country have different interests from those of most of their business captains of industry. That's not to say that there can't be and won't be tremendous opportunities for regional businesses in these local plans, but ironically, they'll have to be dragged to that kicking and screaming.
All right, so I think that is the most of the questions, and I had a question which I had not yet answered. So I can discuss that a little bit, and I'll type out an answer. From Marianne Hill, there's an opportunity cost to this free financing at 0% interest. There's a need to shift production towards education, health, environmental protection, et cetera. How is this cost taken into account? So this is a great question. We'll definitely need to shift some production into these sectors. One way would be to bring in currently non-employed people. So we've got the unemployed and maybe people out of the labor force. So the job opening guarantee would help with that, to bring those resources to bear to this problem, to use all of American human resources to address these kind of existential threats. But also, there probably will be some shifting from other sectors. So how do we coordinate that in a market economy? One way would be to simply bring this production into existence, just spend to enlarge these sectors, like green sectors, and then just rely on the shrinking of the transfers to ensure the economy remains on an even keel. A better way, I think, would be to use things like carbon pricing or carbon taxes to try and shrink the carbon producing sectors faster. So that way we can kind of grow good sectors and shrink bad sectors more quickly. But ultimately, that's the nominal income targeting is important to ensure that we can coordinate these transfers in a way that isn't inflationary or isn't recessionary, to keep the economy on an even keel. But obviously, while there's no financial cost, there obviously is some opportunity cost. And so, other sectors are going to have to shrink to devote some resources to these new sectors. So it's definitely not costless in a global sense, but at least from a financial side, 0% eliminates the financial cost. I had some comments on Don's very excellent discussion of my paper. If anyone else wanted to go first, though, we have about 5 minutes left.
I also have a couple of comments on your discussion, Gabe.
Go ahead.
Go first.
Okay. So I really appreciate these comments. It's really good to see what's, kind of less clear to readers. For me, who are the investors who are going to want these bonds is important, and it's definitely not addressed adequately in the paper. But we do have experiences with negative interest rates in Europe and Japan, and still people buy the bonds. So it might seem irrational, but what's your alternative? Otherwise, you've got to move cash around in armored cars. So it seems that people are willing to buy negative interest rate bonds, and so 0% should work. What you might worry about, though, is maybe there's fewer investors that want the bonds, that the Fed is going to be pumping a lot of money into the economy, because essentially the only buyer will be the Fed. And then also you might worry about just, excessive indebtedness. Maybe there's an issue with financial stability, because, if you have 0% interest rate at all maturities, you'd have 30-year bonds that have 0 interest rates. So then, private sector bonds are going to be correspondingly lower interest rates. They won't be 0. So the Fed won't buy private sector bonds, but obviously, their spreads are going to be constant. And so, you might have 10-year car loans or 20-year car loans, because at 0% interest, the interest rate that the car companies are going to be able to offer are going to be very low. And so then you might get some overheating of the economy from there. So there are clearly some potential costs. And so, you'd want to have high tax, so that then you can, use the shrinking of those transfers to households to try and cool down the economy in the transition. That the transition to 0% interest might be inflationary. And so, you want to make sure that you can address that adequately. So that's definitely a concern. And the other comments, I think, were largely right. And I think in doing the presentation, the discount rate section didn't really fit. So I think I can probably cut that or put that in appendix. I appreciate that. Otherwise, the comments are well appreciated.
Thanks, Gabe. I'll just very quickly respond to one thing that you said. You talked about the application of this methodology I proposed to lagging regions, and certainly the one in which the case is drawn from is an example of that. But I think it's also equally applicable to regions that are doing very well. A couple of examples that I did mention in the paper can illustrate that. One, looking at New York City and its environs vis-a-vis sea level rise and the problem of storm surges. And this, by the way, was done prior to Hurricane Sandy. Just a super interesting scenario done up by an interdisciplinary team, including architects and planners and economists and ecologists. Another one is a more typically academic study done looking at California's Central Valley. and big agriculture, and the options for a technological pathway to a more climate-friendly model of agricultural production, transportation, and consumption. So I think the opportunities are there to generalize this.
Thanks. And I just had a quick comment for Christina that, there's kind of two generations of secular stagnation. There's the original Alvin Hansen one that actually might be better fit. That's actually based on declining population growth because the US population is shrinking. And then by the 30s, there's cutting off of immigration in the 20s. And so he really focuses more on population rather than kind of savings and interest rates. So you might take a look at that. I can send you a link to the Alvin Hansen secular stagnation paper. So we have about 60 seconds left. So I think it's time for our goodbye. So thanks so much for everyone for participating. Thanks so much to the discussants. It's a very important job, even if it's not always appreciated adequately. So thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. And thanks to all the participants that came. Really enjoyed this session very much.
Thank you, John, for the comments. I appreciate it. So anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. So long.